If you've never lived in Tornado Alley, let me paint you a picture. Blue skies at breakfast, hail the size of baseballs by lunch, and, if you're lucky, only half the county is missing a roof by dinner. That's why my family has a storm shelter in the backyard. Not one of those little above-ground plastic ones either. We're talking a full-blown, underground concrete bunker with steel doors, emergency lighting, and enough canned beans to last 3 generations. It was installed by my grandfather back in the early 2000s after a twister nearly wiped out the high school football field. Grandpa doesn't believe in halfway measures. He calls it the whole and treats it like a sacred family heirloom. Now, before this story goes off the rails, and trust me, it will, you need to understand something about my grandpa. He's 82, a retired Air Force mechanic, and the kind of man who sharpens his lawnmower blades by hand because it builds character. He reads military history like it's scripture and still refers to World War II as the Big One, even though he was born after it ended. He also hates the HOA with a passion. When my parents bought this house 5 years ago, the HOA was more bark than bite. Just a few old-timers complaining about trampoline nets and mailbox paint. But last year, Karen was elected president, and everything changed. Her real name's Angela, but nobody calls her that. Not even her husband. She earned the name Karen within 2 weeks of getting elected, and she's lived up to it every day since. She patrols the neighborhood like a mall cop, carrying a clipboard, a measuring tape, and a deep-seated need to feel superior. It started small. Letters about our trash cans being visible from the street for too long. Then complaints about the height of our hedges, the unauthorized wind chimes on our porch, and my personal favorite, the time she sent a warning because our Halloween skeleton was too anatomically aggressive. But her biggest obsession? The storm shelter. It sits in the backyard, about 15 feet from the back porch. A metal door flush with the ground, painted forest green so it doesn't stand out. You'd barely notice it unless you were looking for it. Which Karen was. She first brought it up during a casual HOA meeting at the community center. I was there with Grandpa, mostly for the free cookies. Karen clicked her little laser pointer at a slideshow presentation. Yes, a slideshow. And up came a picture of our backyard. Some properties have installations that don't meet our current visual guidelines, she said, like she was unveiling state secrets. This door, for instance, disrupts the aesthetic flow of the lawn. But Grandpa raised his hand. That's a storm shelter. Karen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I understand, sir, but perhaps it could be relocated to a more discreet location? It's made of reinforced concrete and buried 8 feet underground. So, is that a no? That's a hell no. That was the first shot fired in what would become a full-blown suburban Cold War. Over the next few weeks, Karen sent us 3 formal violation notices regarding backyard structural protrusions. Despite the shelter being installed long before the HOA even existed, Grandpa responded to each one by mailing back the same letter, but with one addition. He'd drawn a middle finger over the HOA. Karen didn't take that well. She started lurking around the property during her morning walks, peeking through the fence, taking photos over the hedge, and one time even bringing a tape measure to the backyard line while pretending to be on a phone call. Grandpa saw her through the kitchen window and stood there shirtless, eating a hot dog like it was war footage on TV. Let her try, he muttered. I got the deed. I got the plans, and I got nothing but time. He wasn't kidding. By the end of that month, he'd installed 2 motion-activated floodlights, a night vision wildlife camera aimed directly at the storm shelter, and a sign that said private property, trespassers may be temporarily detained. I thought he was joking. He wasn't, because what happened next was straight up wild. By the time summer rolled around, the HOA versus Grandpa feud was less a disagreement and more of a neighborhood legend. Kids riding their bikes would slow down near our fence just to sneak a peek at the infamous storm shelter. One of them even claimed to have seen Grandpa polishing it with motor oil while humming the national anthem. I wouldn't put it past him. Karen, on the other hand, was ramping up like a politician in a losing campaign. She called an emergency HOA board meeting at her house and invited only her chosen allies. You know, the ones who never cut their grass, but always have time to report someone else for having their porch light too bright. We didn't go. Neither did most of the neighborhood. That didn't stop her from declaring that the HOA had voted unanimously to demand the storm shelter be modified or temporarily sealed until reviewed by the Aesthetic Oversight Subcommittee. That's not a joke. She really said Aesthetic Oversight Subcommittee like we were living in the Capitol from the Hunger Games. He taped the notice to our front door with pink duct tape, probably thinking it made her look sweet instead of psychotic. Grandpa read the notice in silence, then folded it neatly and used it to level out the leg of our wobbly patio table. The next day, he added a few upgrades to the backyard. A 6-month wooden privacy fence, legally within HOA height limits, a metal no trespassing sign that featured an eagle holding an AR-15, and a new paint job for the storm shelter door. In bold white letters, it now read, "In case of tornado or Karen, open carefully." He was a man possessed, and to be fair, he had reason to be. That shelter saved our butts 3 years ago during a surprise F2 twister. It had history, purpose. It wasn't some decorative gnome statue. It was a lifesaver. Karen didn't see it that way. 2 days after the sign went up, we caught her pacing outside the fence with a clipboard and what looked like a leveler, like she was trying to measure the threat level of a reinforced steel door. When she saw the camera on the porch swivel in her direction, she flipped it off and walked away like she was the one being harassed. He was loving every second of it. "She wants a war of attrition," he told me one afternoon while cleaning the gutters with military precision. "Problem is, I've been retired for 25 years. All I got is time." He started calling her Private Karen and referring to the HOA as the enemy. Every morning, he'd log the previous night's security footage like he was analyzing reconnaissance. He even started keeping a printed log in a notebook labeled Operation Shelter Sentinel. But here's the thing about people like Karen. When control slips from their hands, they don't just let go. They grab tighter, which is exactly what she did. One rainy Thursday evening, I came home from class to find Grandpa sitting at the kitchen table, eyes glued to his tablet, mouth twitching, with what I can only describe as restrained joy. "She did it," he muttered. "What?" She crossed the line, literally. He turned the tablet toward me. The security footage was playing on loop. There she was, umbrella tucked under one arm, dressed in a pink raincoat, like she was headed to a toddler's birthday party, sneaking around the side of the fence. She pulled something from her bag. A crowbar. I gasped. Karen had pried the latch off the storm shelter and opened the door. But that wasn't the insane part. She climbed down into it. The camera angle inside was dark, but you could clearly see her stepping inside the shelter, looking around, poking at shelves like she was inspecting the place for violations. Why would she go inside?" I asked, stunned. Grandpa stood, grabbed his raincoat, and said with a grin, "She's trespassing, and I'm about to detain her, civilian style." Grandpa moved faster than I'd seen him in years. By the time I grabbed my shoes and ran out to the back porch, he was already halfway across the lawn, clutching a flashlight in one hand and what looked like the storm shelter's backup padlock in the other. Rain was coming down in sheets, the sky a shade of greenish black that told every Midwesterner, you've got about 20 minutes before nature tries to kill you. But Grandpa wasn't worried about the weather. He was focused on Karen. When we got to the shelter door, it was wide open, just like in the footage. Her umbrella lay on the grass like a crime scene clue. There were muddy footprints on the concrete lip of the entrance, leading down into the dark. Grandpa didn't hesitate. He knelt down, peered inside, and shouted, "Ma'am, this is private property. You're trespassing on a federally compliant tornado refuge." There was a faint, echoing reply from below. "I'm inspecting for community violations. I have authority." Grandpa rolled his eyes. "You don't have authority in my backyard, and certainly not underground." She shouted something else, but thunder cracked overhead, and honestly, it could have been Latin for all we knew. That's when he did it. He calmly reached up, grabbed the heavy steel door, and slammed it shut. Then, cut! The padlock went through the latch like he'd practiced it. I stood there frozen. Did you just lock her in the shelter?" Grandpa straightened up, brushed water off his sleeves, and nodded. "Sure did. You can't just... She broke into my property. That's a felony. But she's in a hole. She'll be fine. There's emergency lights, water, and food for a week in there. I stocked it last Tuesday. Besides," he added, "the door doesn't even lock from the inside. I'm just making sure she doesn't inspect her way back out before the cops arrive." I blinked at him speechless. Then he pulled out his phone. Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser. No, she's secure. Very secure." He gave the address and calmly described the situation like he was ordering a pizza. Not once did his voice rise. Not once did he show an ounce of panic. He even waved at the neighbor's dog across the fence, mid-call. 15 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up. Officer Reyes, same guy who had ticketed Karen for hitting my mailbox last year, stepped out, squinting through the rain. "Tell me she didn't." Grandpa just smiled and pointed at the padlocked storm door. "She's in there." Reyes blinked. "You're kidding." "Nope." Caught her on camera breaking in. Figured I'd preserve the crime scene. The second officer knelt down, tapped on the door, and called out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" From below came Karen's unmistakable voice. "This is illegal. I'm being held hostage. I demand a lawyer." Reyes looked at Grandpa. "You gave her food and water?" "Yep. It's stocked for emergencies. She could survive the apocalypse in there." "And you locked her in. Why?" Grandpa handed him the tablet with the footage. "Didn't want her escaping before y'all saw this." The officers watched the clip. Reyes didn't even try to hide his smirk. "All right then." They opened the padlock, lifted the door, and Karen emerged like a soaked, furious meerkat. Makeup smeared, hair flattened, raincoat clinging to her like cellophane. She pointed a shaking finger at Grandpa. "You assaulted me with confinement." Officer Reyes raised a hand. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the footage. You entered private property, uninvited, and opened a secure storm shelter without permission. That's criminal trespass. I am the HOA, and this ain't HOA property." He froze. Reyes turned to the second officer. "Cuff her." Karen shrieked. Actually, shrieked. Like a bird being kicked out of its nest. "You're making a mistake. I was trying to enforce compliance. I have right." Reyes nodded calmly. "You sure do. And you'll have a chance to explain them to the judge." As they walked her out to the cruiser, mutty, shouting, mascara streaked, like a Tim Burton character, Grandpa leaned over to me and whispered, "She was in there for 20 minutes and didn't even notice the canned peaches." I nearly choked. We watched her drive away in the back of the cruiser, still protesting her innocence like someone who'd just been denied entry to a country club. The yard was quiet again. The shelter door hung open, rain still tapping against it like soft applause. Grandpa stepped over and gently closed it, securing the latch. Not with a lock this time, just respect. And just like that, the war was over. Almost. The day after Karen got hauled off in the back of a patrol car, the neighborhood was buzzing like someone had spiked the community bulletin board with espresso. I swear, half the block just happened to walk their dogs past our house that morning. Every single one of them paused long enough to look at the storm shelter. Some nodded, some smirked. One guy even gave it a slow golf clap. Grandpa, naturally, sat on the porch like a king surveying his land, sipping black coffee from his old HOA equals home of assholes mug that he hadn't used in years. He'd earned it. Now let's be clear, I thought the whole storm shelter stunt would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. From the moment she was released, hours later, with a citation for criminal trespassing and a court date, she launched what I can only describe as a full-scale PR campaign to save face. She started sending out neighborhood-wide emails from her personal address because, surprise, she was temporarily suspended from the HOA email account. Subject lines like, "Urgent truth about the so-called shelter incident. A dangerous trend of vigilantism in our community. Why I was forced to act." Her claim? That she entered our shelter because she feared for community safety and had reason to believe the structure was harboring unauthorized materials. I don't even know what that means. Like we were hiding explosives under our canned corn? She ended each email with her usual flourish. Together, we can make Oak Valley safe and compliant again. Grandpa printed them out and used them to line the garage trash can. But her emails weren't enough. She went door to door. I watched from the living room window as she walked from house to house like a Jehovah's Witness for HOA fascism. She clutched a clipboard full of what looked like petitions and paused on every porch for at least 10 minutes, talking with the kind of hand gestures only people who have lost the argument start using. But here's the thing, the tide had turned. When she got to Stan's house, our neighbor and former HOA board member, he opened the door, saw her, and literally closed it without saying a word. When she got to the Jeffersons' house, they listened politely for 5 minutes, then handed her one of their homemade no HOA harassment cookies. The message was sugar-coated, but clear. People were done with her. And it wasn't just the neighbors. The HOA board had called an emergency meeting. This time, a real one. And Stan personally invited Grandpa to attend. At first, Grandpa said, "Hell no." But after I reminded him that nothing scared Karen more than a room full of people she couldn't control, he changed his mind. The meeting was held in the community rec room. Beige walls, folding chairs, and that faint smell of stale coffee and crushed egos. Karen showed up, naturally, dressed like she was headed to a court hearing, gray blazer, tightly pinned hair, folder clutched against her chest like a riot shield. Grandpa, cargo pants, camel ball cap, and a pocket notepad titled, "My Rights." The board chair, Ms. Pritchard, called the meeting to order. She was a soft-spoken, retired librarian who'd been steamrolled by Karen for years. But tonight, her voice didn't shake. Before we begin, I'd like to read a statement from the HOA legal consultant. The room got quiet. Real quiet. The board has reviewed the security footage provided by Mr. Richardson, she continued, as well as the police report. We find that the actions taken by Ms. Whitmore were not only outside her jurisdiction, but in violation of both HOA bylaws and municipal law. Karen's face froze. Effective immediately, Ms. Whitmore is removed from her position as acting president. Furthermore, she is barred from holding any board position for a period of no less than 5 years. You could hear a pin drop. Then someone in the back softly muttered, "Thank God." Karen stood up like she was about to object. Her mouth opened, but Stan beat her to it. "You're lucky no one's pressing felony charges," he said. "Honestly, you should be grateful you got locked in that shelter. That was probably the safest place for you." That got a few chuckles. Even Miss Pritchard cracked a smile. Karen stormed out. No speech, no goodbye, just the sound of her heels echoing off linoleum like a retreating army in defeat. Later that night, Grandpa sat on the porch again, flipping through a small manila envelope Stan had handed him after the meeting. "What's that?" I asked. He held up the envelope, grinning. Inside were the original installation permits for the storm shelter, stamped, signed, sealed from 15 years ago. "Proof of victory," he said. The morning after Karen's dramatic removal from the HOA board, you could feel the difference in the air, like the humidity of passive-aggressive tyranny had finally lifted. Grandpa called it Liberation Day. Even the birds sounded less stressed. We figured that after the meeting, Karen would keep her head down, maybe lay low, maybe even, dare I dream, apologize. But no, she doubled down. Within 48 hours, her house was up for sale. A massive real estate sign appeared on her front lawn, complete with a QR code and the words, "Apartment sale, no interference." Oh, the irony. Word spread fast. People started placing bets on whether she'd actually sell before the court date hit. A few of the neighbors even hosted a little Karen farewell bonfire in their backyard. We didn't attend, but someone dropped off a plate of burnt marshmallows labeled Justice S'mores. Classy move. Grandpa mostly stayed quiet about it, but I could tell he was enjoying every second. He finally pulled down the security cameras, filled in the logbook titled Operation Shelter Sentinel, and started using the storm shelter the way it was intended, to store emergency gear and the neighborhood's best-kept stash of canned ravioli. But he wasn't quite done yet. 3 weeks later, after Karen officially sold the house to a sweet retired couple who brought Grandpa homemade peach cobbler, he hosted a backyard BBQ. Nothing fancy. Just hot dogs, lawn chairs, cold lemonade, and half the neighborhood stopping by with sides and folding tables. At one point, people started gathering around the shelter like it was a local landmark, taking turns telling their favorite Karen horror stories. "She fined me for hanging a pride flag," one neighbor said. "She wrote me up for leaving my garden hose out," another added. He said my dog's bark was unacceptable during nap hours. By the end, it felt more like a support group than a cookout. Then Grandpa stood up on a cinder block, tapped a spoon against a metal thermos, and cleared his throat. Yeah, y'all been thinking," he said. "That shelter's been through a lot. It's kept us safe from tornadoes, drama, and at least one sociopathic clipboard enthusiast." Laughter. "So I figure it's earned a new name." He stepped aside, and there it was, a brand new engraved plaque, bolted into the steel door of the shelter. "The Karen Containment Unit," Esther pleaded. The crowd absolutely lost it. Somebody started a slow clap. Someone else took a selfie with the plaque. The Jefferson kids asked if they could paint a cartoon version of Karen on the door. Grandpa declined, but offered them a piece of peach cobbler instead. The name stuck. To this day, people still call it that. Whenever a new neighbor asks, "What's that thing in the backyard?" we all just smile and say, "Oh, that's the Karen Containment Unit." Long story. It's funny how something as ordinary as a storm shelter could turn into a symbol, not just of safety, but of standing up to pettiness, to control freaks, to people who mistake authority for permission. Grandpa didn't build that shelter for battle, but he won one anyway. And in the end, the thing Karen tried hardest to bury ended up being the very thing that buried her reputation instead. She tried to turn our neighborhood into her kingdom. All it took to stop her was one stubborn old man, a camera, a padlock, and a concrete hole in the ground. Sometimes justice isn't flashy. Sometimes it doesn't come with sirens or speeches or dramatic music. Sometimes it's just a steel door clicking shut behind the person who never thought they'd get caught. Moral of the story: if you try to take control of someone else's storm shelter, you'd better be ready to weather the fallout. Thanks for watching, and hey, if you've ever had a Karen try to break into your life, drop it in the comments. We'll keep the shelter ready.